welcome to tonight's Labour Left Alliance educational session. It's perhaps more of a discussion than a straightforward educational session in the usual sense, but it's a very relevant topic, one which does have some historical resonance, but perhaps given the current situation in Britain, following the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, we are going to discuss tonight the future of the monarchy, the nature of the monarchy in our society, and its function, both political and social. It's a panel discussion. Although I'll be acting as chair, I will also be chipping in on occasions. But we've got two main speakers. We've Tina Werkmann and Steve Freeman. Tina, who is the secretary of the LLA, very important comrade, and Steve Freeman, who's a member of the Republican Labour group, who's been doing some work on the nature of republicanism in the LLA. What we'll do is have the two comrades all make some opening contributions, then we'll throw it out to the floor and get a discussion going in the usual way with questions and so forth. Could I just also appeal to comrades that if you do want to come in, to use the raise hand function on your control panels, and that's often a lot easier to for me and for the other comrades to see. Okay, well, I'd like to begin by just making a few introductory remarks. We've had a number of discussions about the monarchy, both in our historical sections, particularly in our issues of revolution. The overthrow of monarchies and the arguments for democracy have always been central in the socialist movement. But of course, in recent years, these have perhaps come more into public light with the various scandals and indeed the various crises affecting the British royal family. A few weeks ago, we had a discussion around the issue of Harry and Meghan, and that was really a combination, or that crisis seemed to be a combination of soap opera and political crisis. In particular, the way that various parts of society took sides, whether you were in favour of Harry and Meghan or whether you supported the firm, whether Harry and Meghan represented a sort of modernising contemporary touch for the monarchy, or whether the traditions of the monarchy as represented by the Queen, Duke of Edinburgh and so on, were really worthy of being upheld. And of course, we've had the recent death of the Duke of Edinburgh, which has brought all these issues back to the fore. In particular, the nature of the monarchy. I'm sure that comrades have been very well aware of the wall-to-wall coverage. Those of us who listen to the radio and watch the television, BBC in particular, couldn't fail to miss last Friday just complete blanket coverage of the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, whole series of accounts of his life, what an extraordinary, remarkable man he was, wonderful things that he did. His whole, I suppose, function was retold endlessly. What was interesting about this wasn't just that it was wall-to-wall coverage, but it did receive some of the highest complaints about the BBC's coverage. The last recorded figure, I think, was about 103 or 109,000, which is quite large. And of course, if we went into the shops to buy a newspaper over the succeeding days, we would fall over ourselves with special royal supplements, 20, 30 pages of broadsheet papers on the royal family, on the Duke of Edinburgh, and so on and so forth. So it's been a very big issue. But of course, a lot of the coverage has been around the Duke of Edinburgh as a man, and I think he is an interesting man. He comes from an interesting background, but it isn't really as a personality. It isn't the racist gaffes or the rather gruff traditional views that he was supposed to upheld, or even the fact that he was alleged a Renaissance man who could talk about everything from wildlife and cosmology through to poetry and fine art. It is, I think, more about the politics and the social importance of the Duke of Edinburgh that we're going to discuss this evening. So I'd like to bring in our two speakers now. The first one will be Tina, and then we'll follow up with Steve. Okay, Tina, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you. Kevin likes to tell me off for chairing too actively. I think that was a pretty active introduction, but a very good one, obviously. Yes, it's been a week, hasn't it? And we're, as socialists, we're probably all in agreement that we don't like. There's non-stop coverage in the media, the sycophantic, looking at the man, the myth, the grandpa of the nation. He's now called grandfather of the nation. You can just imagine how many times he's popped over to Kate and Williams to, look after the little ones when those two are working, to do his grandfather duties. I never, they're not that kind of family. So it's all very myth making going on here. He's the animal lover he was, a nature conservationist who just happens to regularly go hunting and drive a Land Rover, etc. But he was a really good guy, and he was really good on the barbecue as well. Master of the barbecue, that seems to have been his main skill. My favorite tribute comes from Harriet Harman, who says he was a true feminist because he's given up everything to marry Elizabeth Windsor and to support her. What a true, fighter for women's rights he was. It actually seems to me that the bloke had quite a good life. I don't think he gave up that much. He had one of the easier jobs in the family firm. Not really at the forefront. Able to make daft jokes, hovering around in the background. Pretty cushy job. But there is something about it does say something about our society, of course, which goes beyond what we can make jokes, etc. But this is it's a serious issue. How serious it is, for example, it became clear when Jeremy Corbyn dared to put out a tweet an hour or so after the death was announced, and it wasn't about Philip, it was about Bolivia. Can you imagine putting out a tweet that's not about Philip? So sadly, and make of it what you will, he buckled under the pressure and took it off, and then sent his condolences instead. So I think we all agree that it was pretty unpleasant, all of this show of, what a lovely man he was, etc. I'm more interested actually in looking at how the left has been viewing this issue, and how the left more generally looks at the question of the monarchy. Just a parasite, a racist parasite, is how a socialist worker, for example, summed up his death. Was the guy more racist than other blokes of his generation? Probably not much, but everything he said, gets in the public domain. So, there were plenty of people who make comments like that, who are not getting every little word listened to, etc. The parasite comment obviously deals with the old favorite of how many millions we pay out each year to keep the monarchy going, taxpayers' money, how much it costs us, etc. I think that is a really daft argument and daft comment, because it's also, you look at how much money they bring in to tourism, etc. It's really easy for a right winger or the establishment to bat that one away. Kate Middleton wears a dress and boom, the sales go through the roof. She's made £20,000 for a British plucky little company whose dress she's worn, etc. So I think the money question is a very bad argument to make, and it doesn't serve us well at all. Also very common on the left is, I think, the idea that the monarchy is just a relic from the past. It's just a hangover. It's not important at all. She's just, she goes around and it's quite cute and, cuts ribbons, etc. It's just an unimportant ceremonial role. It doesn't really matter if you get rid of it or not, which I think it's an attitude that's called economism on the left, which is the idea that as lefties, we should focus merely on the issues that directly affect the working class: higher wages, better working conditions, that kind of stuff. You know, things like the monarchy, the House of Lords, they're for other people, they're for the other classes, you know, they're just diversions. There's no need for us to have a serious attitude to it. It would be quite nice if we had a republic, but it's not, you know, it's not something we have to campaign for or argue for. And I really want to argue against that attitude, which I think is very problematic and says a lot about, I think, the left, unfortunately. I think the monarchy plays a huge role in keeping power structures in place in Britain and abroad. It keeps the illusion alive that we're all in it together, you know, the plucky Brits, we're all in it together. I'm not British, obviously, you've noticed that, but I've kind of, you know, been here long enough. And all this, you know, we're all in it together is extremely important at the moment, of course, when it comes to COVID, which we're told, you know, again, we're all in the same boat, we're all suffering, etc. Poor Queenie has to sit alone at the funeral, you know, there's nobody because she's not sharing a bubble, etc. Even she is suffering like that. When, you know, I think the COVID crisis really has exposed class differences quite dramatically. If you had a bit of money, if you're okay, you know, you kind of got through it perhaps by learning the guitar, etc. You know, some people had an okay time. If you're hard up though, if you're a member of the working class with a precarious job perhaps, or a normal working class woman with a child, you know, that's quite a different story, what's been going on in the last few months. And it really has exposed, we're not in the same boat at all. Very few of us can afford a live-in nanny or a teacher, or tutor, etc. It's been quite hellish for normal working class people. It's an interesting episode last weekend. My daughter had a football match, my 7-year-old daughter, and we were informed by the Football Association beforehand that we're supposed to hold a minute of silence for Prince Philip, you know, for 7-year-olds. I was preparing to talk all the way through it, but luckily the other side also was not interested in holding a minute's silence, so it didn't happen. But I think it really sums up quite in a very small way what this is all about. You drum it even into little ones that this is an unshakable institution. It belongs to Britain, like fish and chips or chicken tikka masala. And Philip Battenberg's death, you know, and the publicity surrounding it has been really used to emphasize that the monarchy's got this right to rule over us as subject. If you're 7-year-old, if you're 70, you know, we're all there to be ruled over. It's not surprising that this illusion does come under a lot of pressure all the time. And depending on the news cycle and where we're at and what's happened, up to 50% of people in Britain do oppose the monarchy. The younger you are, the more opposed to the monarchy you tend to be. But the royals are actually they're working their socks off to keep this illusion alive, that there's unshakable institution. Hundreds of outings a year these people have to attend. Attend the daftest of opening ceremonies and ribbon cuttings, etc., to make sure that they're seen and admired and always there. And it's not really surprising that some people want out of that life. So the recent departure of Harry and Meghan, as Kevin has indicated, has actually been quite has been shaking the monarchy, because it does actually, sort of shake, sort of question this idea, this is unshakable, this is always there. The royals are, supposed to be like Hotel California, isn't it? You can never leave. It puts it's a question mark over the whole claim that is this solid as a rock. Add to that the claims of racism, and you can imagine that didn't go down that well in the Commonwealth countries. That again, another in part of the constitutional makeup of the UK, that these countries are supposed to have the Queen as a head of state unquestioningly, etc. So this departure with the racism claims has challenged the whole constitutional setup of the UK. And no wonder it's been quite a few difficult weeks. And the more, the part of the reason why Prince Philip's death has been blown up quite so much, I believe. This comes at a time when the monarchy is actually still reeling from the whole trauma over Princess Diana, when they exposed the family as a heartless bunch of bastards, which has been all nicely repeated in the hit series The Crown. It's all seen by millions about how badly Diana was treated, etc., etc. And I think in times like these, it actually becomes apparent how fragile this institution actually is. It's not solid as a rock at all. How much effort goes into keeping it going, and how much myth making has to happen with all these traditions and the pomp and everything. And the myth of over Prince Philip just being a plucky old man who got on with it and supported the Queen. It's a bit, these are national myth making stories, like the story that Britain fought the Second World War to save Jews, or that Britain won, and it had nothing to do with the Soviet Union or America getting involved in the war. So it's myth making of the highest order. It is, of course, possible, though quite unlikely, to have a smooth transition from monarchy to republic. The Guardian, for example, had a campaign a few years back where they, similarly to the Republic group, wanted the monarch to be replaced with an elected head of state. Republic put it this way: in place of the Queen, we want someone chosen by the people, not running the government, but representing the nation independently of our politicians. Remember the independent German president, Paul von Hindenburg? He put Adolf Hitler in power in 1933. It's a bit of an extreme example, perhaps, but it does illustrate that it's quite delusional to think there's somebody independent of, the Tories, Labour Party, class politics, who could be given such a job. There is actually no need, there's absolutely no need for some kind of a second bourgeois revolution to do a of lords from above. The bourgeoisie had their chance and they messed it up a long time ago. I believe it's time that the working class takes this question very seriously, the left, because it does go right to the heart of the way we are ruled and what kind of society we actually envisage. What do we mean when we say the liberation of all of humanity, a classless society, giving everybody the chance to lead a fully human, rounded life? What does that mean? To live a life that's not run by wasting your time surviving in a dull job, working 8 hours a day, if you can even, rather than searching for the next 0-hour contract or getting the crumbs from the capitalist table, which is what a lot of people, how they live, from hand to mouth. For socialists, it's about getting involved in the running of society from the bottom to the top. And as Marx put it, if we all get involved in it, then we're all bureaucrats running society, which means none of us are bureaucrats. We're all involved in running in society, which is what socialism is about. This is why we have to take, I think, the question of the monarchy seriously if we ever want the working class to become the ruling class. Because history does show that the downfall of a monarchy is almost, without exception, always coincides with a revolutionary situation when the working class is close to, taking power or is close to really challenging the status quo, as happened all over Europe in 1918. It's only just over 100 years ago. It's not a huge amount of time away. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, cousin of the current Lottie in Britain, had to pack his bags rather swiftly and exit the country. And that was the similar story in a lot of countries across Europe, because the working class was very strong and was challenging for power. So I think the fight for a democratic republic is not a diversion from the struggle for socialism. It is really part and parcel of it. It is hugely important that we take that struggle seriously. And it is a part of the remaking of society from top to bottom. And I think by establishing a republic, we would also do people like the Queen, William Windsor, Kate Middleton, Harry, Meghan, etc., and their offspring a huge favor, liberating from a hugely alienated life that comes with their role, going around, talking nonsense all day and not saying anything of any interest to anybody, so that you can appeal to everybody, and giving them the opportunity to become rounded human beings and live a normal life. So it's not, chopping their heads off, etc., though, if needs must. But, I think as socialists, we have a much more human solution to these things. You know, step aside and let us take over. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tina. I'm glad no royals were injured in the making of that talk. Okay, I now hand over to Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin and comrades. And I agree with what Tina said and what also Kevin said before. But obviously, I'm going to try and take a slightly different tack, so as not, as it were, to repeat what Tina said, even though I agree with the case she's argued. And so I thought I would begin with a nursery rhyme. I don't know whether Tina would know this nursery rhyme or whether comrades would. Do you remember the one which was sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't it a dainty dish to set before the king? Now, if you remember the next bit, it tells us the king was in the counting house, counting out the money, and the queen was in the parlor eating bread and honey. So I suppose if we updated it a little bit, the queen was in the counting house, and it was the duke who was eating the bread and honey. That's it. So park that for a minute. The theme, of course, is a nation in mourning. Why is it time to be rid of the monarchy? And of course, that's been because of the death of, and I've written him down as Citizen Philip. That is Citizen Philip Schleswig Holstein Soderberg Gluckstein, which is actually his actual family name, if you wrote it out properly. And obviously, as Republicans, we believe the death of any citizen should be a private matter for family and friends to grieve over their loss, etc. Not a political event in which the royalist ruling class and their party leaders and the royalist press participate in a political demonstration, because that's what it is, of their support for the institution of the monarchy. Nor should it be an opportunity for them to reincorporate people or the nation into this giant confidence trick by renewing support for the ruling class through their tributes, the tributes of these sycophantic and corrupt politicians. Now, to highlight the political nature of this event, the question is whether the question has arisen is whether the disgraced Prince Andrew should dress up in an admiral's uniform, and whether Citizen Harry should wear his uniform, as he actually was a soldier. And of course, that's a highly political question because it sheds light on some of the internal contradictions within the firm, or if you like, on the board of directors of Royal Family Limited. And it shows how sensitive they are. I mean, the point is, are they really that strong, or are they just very, very sensitive? It does stand in sharp contradiction to the 130,000 people who died from COVID-19, many of whom died because of the poor planning, the austerity policies, the mismanagement and neoliberal politics of Her Majesty's government. The Queen and Citizen Philip take all their plaudits as head of state and consort, but none of the responsibilities. In terms of public service, there were deaths of many health workers who died in the line of duty carrying out their public service. And I say public service because this is one of the big arguments about the monarchy that I'll come on to in a minute, about public service. I've looked at some of the different approaches to the issue, and I've got three here from the bit of reading around I've done. There's one which is personal, which concentrates on Philip and his attributes and his politics. So we can have a discussion about him, the man, his politics. Dave Calloway writes an article, Prince Philip, isn't the Duke of Edinburgh scheme fantastic, ? And he's obviously being a bit sarcastic when he says that. Mike Small, an interesting article in Bella Caledonia, talks of Philip and the tiger, talking about his credentials as an environmentalist and tiger hunting, which Tina's also mentioned. Labour List, which gives you all the speeches of all the Labour leaders. And there's plenty of other things. Tony had a blog, which I didn't kind of get back to. Our own Tony, that is Tony Greensea, had a blog about issues like racism and I think his connection to Israel or his visit to Israel. I didn't fully get back to look at that, and Tony may tell us. So that's one set of approaches to look at the person himself. There's another different approach, which I would call historical, to concentrate on the historical context to understand the meaning. Polly Toynbee in The Guardian does one, Prince Philip's death is the end of an era. What's the future for the royals? So she's speaking about an era. And what is this era and how can we understand it? And then there's another final thing that I came across, which is quite interesting, which is about the success of the social monarchy and the failure of republicanism. That's Stephen Bush writing in the New Statesman. He says the greatest tribute to Prince Philip is not the media, but the silence of the Republicans. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute, because obviously a lot of these issues we're going to be looking at in our Republican Labour working group. But I wanted to take the same approach as Polly Toynbee, the historical context about the nature of the epoch that we're living in, and then address the arguments of Stephen Bush, why he's actually both, in one sense, right and wrong. And if we want to understand the present situation, the crisis we're in, how do we understand the present epoch? So my thesis would be that we're actually living through the final stage of the life of a constitutional monarchy established 300 years ago. The state and the constitution, which survived periodically by being reformed and periodically reinventing itself. And I believe that we're in the last stage of that. And that last stage, that final stage, was the invention of the social monarchy. Now, the social monarchy, the term which I use, was established during the Second World War, probably the foundation, in the foundation of the wartime coalition, consummated by the 1945 Labour government. And although it was created under the reign of George VI, we've come to associate it with Queen Elizabeth. We could think of the social monarchy as the Elizabethan welfare state. And the essence of the social monarchy is in the ideology that the monarch represents public service, not private profit. And that's seen in all of the tributes to citizen Philip in his life of public service, as they say, alongside the Queen. Now, I'll just give you my own little, just to illustrate it, my own personal memory, I can just about remember this, of this epoch, was having a coronation mug. We all had a coronation mug and it had a royal coat of arms on the side. And I have this idea of memory of sitting there drinking free National Health orange juice that was provided by the National Health Service. So we had the Queen, in that little mug, we had the Queen and we had the National Health Service as it was back in the 1950s. And when we went to school, we got free school milk and we got cod liver oil tablets. So when did all this go to pot then? Well, I think the first symbolic moment was probably in 1971 when the Secretary of State for Education put a stop to free school milk. Remember, she was called Margaret Thatcher, and she got the name Margaret Thatcher, the milk snatcher, because she took the free school milk away. So if I had to have a few more dates, I'll skip over this very, very quickly. 1979, Thatcher government, the destruction of the social monarchy. 1984, the defeat of the miners. It was really important that the working class movement had to suffer a defeat for the neoliberal project to take off. 1997, when Tony Blair came in and didn't reverse any of the things that went on. Thatcher called him her greatest achievement. And then the last part of it now, 2008, neoliberalism was exposed as an economic and social disaster. And yet what we've had is the continuation under the policy of austerity of all of those things that were taking place before, privatization and very harsh austerity. So I'll call this epoch, this last stage from 2008 to 2021, right up to now, I'll call it the degenerated social monarchy. The final stage in the death agony, the process of disintegration. Maybe it's zombification. You know, the social monarchy is now the living dead, a human creature which is both dead and dangerous. So this is a period we're now living in where corruption, poverty, racism and alienation are on the rise, and our civil liberties and our liberal democracy are in retreat. It's a period where the old is dying, but the new is not yet ready to be born. We are simply stuck in the mud. We can't move on from the situation. Zombies, of course, are both contagious and dangerous because they infect growing numbers of people, and they become, in the words of the Cambridge Dictionary, persons or people who have no energy, who seem to act without thinking, and do not notice what's happening. So I think a lot of them are becoming zombified in this period. But anyway, zombies are growing and spreading. We're too weak to kill them off. I did look at how we could kill them off, and I found that you need swords, chainsaws, crossbows, etc. But anyway, we don't have these weapons. So all we're really doing is, no, don't bring on any more bad stuff, and just close our eyes, cross our fingers, and hope it goes away. And if you read Polly Toynbee's article, she's describing what I've described to you, not in the same way, not using the same language, but she's describing a similar process that's been taking place since 1945. She thinks the royal epoch is coming to an end, but it doesn't present it in that way. The old liberal democracy is dying, but the new republican democracy is not ready to take its place. That's the problem that we've got. Now, Stephen Bush, in his article in the New Statesman, brings in another point which is relevant to this. He says that he thinks the biggest achievement of the Duke's life is he leaves the British monarchy looking considerably more secure than he found it. Well, that's not kind of what I'm saying, but he does say a great deal has changed since Prince Philip married the then Princess Elizabeth in 1947. But the most revealing shift concerns the Labour Party, whose parliamentary ranks contained more unrepentant Republicans in 1947 than it does today. Not only are Labour's Republicans diminished in number, but their confidence has also waned, he says. So he then points to, so while he was leader, Jeremy Corbyn, a lifelong Republican, felt obliged to say that he had watched the Queen's televised address on Christmas Day. The claim was unconvincing. He said he watched it in the morning when the speech was aired in the afternoon. But it's a testament to the political power and popularity of the British Crown that Corbyn felt he had to make this claim at all. So that's the strength of our republicanism. It's actually quite weak. He concludes, by the way, Stephen Bush, that is, that the irony of these tributes is and those yet to come is that the biggest achievement of Philip's life is that he leaves the British monarchy looking considerably more secure than he found it. And in an ever-changing world, the Crown has managed to modernize and survive. Now, I'm going to challenge that idea. He ends up saying his greatest tribute are, he says, in the bitten tongues and the buttoned up lips of even the country's Republicans, who will hope they have a more successful time under the next consort than they did under this one. So this is Stephen Bush talking about the failure of republicanism, the weakness of it, and the lack of republicanism within the Labour Party, which in a way is saying, do you know what, it is secure because there's no force ready to do anything about it. There's no conscious party, there's no political class that really wants to get rid of the monarchy. So, to unpick this a little bit, and look at it in a slightly different way, we have to draw the distinction between the Crown and the monarchy. If we take the Crown as to be the kingly power and see who wields the kingly power, and that is central to any critique of what's taking place. Now let us return to these examples and begin. Let's go back, Stuart. We'll go back now to our 4 and 20 blackbirds, all right? So the king or the queen was in the counting house counting out the money. So we might ask ourselves, well, where is the counting house then in that case? Where is this counting house? And we all know where it is. It's Her Majesty's Treasury. This is at the very center of the Crown, where the Crown has the secrets of power, where the secrets of the magic money tree are found. Nobody really knows what goes on there because it's kept a secret or is shrouded in mystery. And that's very fundamental to the nature of Crown power. So I imagine the Queen getting up every day and going from Buckingham Palace to the Treasury and spending the day counting out all the money. Then I realized the opposite is true. Of course, the Queen is like a decoy. Her job is to stay away from the Treasury, stay in Buckingham Palace, go around the country, go to Windsor Castle, wherever it is. But the essence of the contract is to make sure that people don't look at where the power of the Crown really is. It's in the immense power concentrated in Her Majesty's treasury. That's where the power of the crown actually is. And we're not looking at that when we are thinking of the Queen. We're looking in some other direction, and that's the trick. Who wields the power of the crown? The Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, etc., etc. Which then leads me on to something else, which is, it turns out, of course, that the former chief executive of the Crown Corporation, certain King David, or Dodgy David is called, has been using all his insider influence to secure £400 million from Her Majesty's Treasury's magic money tree to help Lex Greensill out of a hole. Greensill Capital is tied up in supporting Gupta Steel. You've been following this other story, of course, that's going on in parallel, with an estimated $5 billion exposure in loans. And this is a very scandal that goes to the heart of how our system of government. Now, it turns out that Lex Greensill was brought into government by a certain Sir Jeremy Hayward, who was the cabinet secretary under Cameron, and who also had a job as a banker at one point. And he brought Lex Greensill under Cameron into the heart of government. Jeremy Hayward is the most powerful, was, when he was the cabinet secretary, the most powerful person in the country that most people had never heard of, because he's absolutely central to understanding how the crown and the power of the executive actually works. I'll leave that one because we could talk about that. And now I'm going to say one other thing happened. That was the Belfast Riot. So I want to throw that into the pot as well. You know, when we start looking at the Belfast Riots, they were suspended. I was trying to find out, were they suspended? They were rioting, the loyalist youth of North Belfast, but they were rioting on a daily basis because they become totally pissed off with the way things are going. And they were called upon by their lawyers to suspend their riot the day after the Duke, or during the day that the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral take place. Being loyal subjects, they were going to stand to attention rather than throwing petrol bombs. I wasn't quite sure if they did that. I think probably they did on the Saturday night. But anyway, here's another aspect of the crown that's in crisis. So if we don't take Stephen Bush's idea that we're only talking about the Queen, and we start to look at the crisis in the state, we start to look at what's going on in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the failure of all these things under the Boris Johnson government, the prorogue, all these other issues, we bring them together, then we see a different picture. We see the crown in crisis. We see that what's happening in the royal family is something connected, but not the same. We shouldn't just focus on them, as Tina already said. We've got to look at the total picture of the executive power of the state, which is currently facing a very, very deep crisis. We have to bring all those things together in this period. I call it a degenerate social monarchy, where we're in an end game, as it were, of that. The problem we've got is there isn't a Republican force could do anything about it. We're between the crisis of the old and the arrival of the new. I thought I'd end up this point, if I could. I haven't been taking note of any time. In praise of Citizen Philip, I thought I'd have three things to say in praise of Citizen Philip. And what has he contributed to our understanding of monarchy? So I could only find these three. Well, one was he had this film. I won't go over the film of 1969, but anyway. In the Telegraph's obituary, he says, he wrote in 1977, people still respond more easily, this is Philip, to symbolism than to reason. The idea of chieftainship is in its representative rather than its governing function is still just as clearly and even instinctively understood. From the point of view of national identity, this function is perhaps more important than ever. So he's pointing out it's the role of the Queen to be the chief, but not actually to do any governing. It's a very, very powerful thing. So he points that out. He also came up with the term firm, which I think is quite useful, to identify the monarchy as a business, rather like as distinct from the crown, by the way. Royal Family Limited, I call it, distinct from the crown as a corporation, as a corporate entity. And then my last one, okay. He designed a modified Land Rover with an elongated chassis to carry his coffin. He was surely, as we say in Cockney land, having a laugh, or having his laugh at our expense. I'll finish there.
Thanks very much, Steve. Okay, we've got one comrade wants to come in so far, but as a sort of discussant or respondent, I'd like to ask a couple of questions before we take it into general discussion. I wonder, Tina, if you could sort of comment on, I suppose, the social role of monarchy, which you spent quite a bit of time on. And I'm thinking particularly, I'm not trying to say this because obviously you weren't born here. You did not benefit from the little NHS mug, sorry, orange juice and coronation mug. But I wondered if you could comment on what you think that social role is. Steve uses the phrase social monarchy, and I think it's an interesting one because it seems to suggest that the monarchy has a sort of a social role, not only to stabilize the system, but to be a focus of loyalty. And I'm thinking particularly the role, say, of the monarchy in the armed forces and, you know, the oaths of allegiance and the rest of it. In other words, that everything that talks about the power in the state is actually in and around the monarchy in that way. And then really a question to Steve, and you make a distinction there between the crown and the monarchy, which a lot of people I think will be slightly confused about. And that of course is that I think that you're trying to distinguish between the state power, which is technically the crown or crown in parliament, to use the constitutional language, which is actually in the hands of the executive, the prime minister and people like Jeremy Haywood that you mentioned. And that power is a prerogative power that's used by the executive. So it's actually a real concentration of power, but it's not actually in the hands of the monarch as such. And I suppose then the monarchy, which has this sort of social function, but also maybe a reserve function as well. So those are a couple of points that you might like to consider. And then one last point, which is historical. And as someone who does have an interest in history and is particularly fascinated by the revolutionary period in Europe, I did look at the background of the Duke of Edinburgh. He was also he had a number of other titles. I must say it's a long time since I've come across Schleswig-Holstein, which was one of the big questions of the 19th century. And that sort of illustrates really his multinational nature. He was both a Prince of Denmark and a Prince of Greece. And the family's origins lie in different parts of Europe. They lie both in Britain, as Tony reminds us in the chat, the role of various German monarchs in Britain. But also there are these connections into Greece and indeed to other parts of Europe. And in a way, there is one way that Prince Philip personally was a historical relic, in the sense that he was part of that European aristocracy that intermarried with each other in the years before the revolutions that Tina referred to. And he was connected to all of the other royal families in Europe, as are the British royal family in general. And they're part of, in a sense, a transnational European royal class. And so although there was a lot of talk about him being this sort of quintessential Englishman, he was born in Greece. His family antecedents come from a number of different countries, and he was educated in at least 3 countries. So in other words, he's an historical relic, but he's also, I suppose, shows the way that an historical relic, these remnants of the past, can be utilized today and can be used, you know, for the purposes of the ruling class. Anyway, I've said enough now, and I'll just move on to questions. Mike Kennard first.
Yeah, I mean, that point you made about it's quintessential Englishman. Actually, you're not far wrong, because we're a very mongrel race, and of course he qualifies quite well in that respect. Two points. I think you touched on it just then about the the background role, the reserve role of the monarchy in a time of deep crisis, that Parliament can be suspended, as Boris Johnson did. Parliament can be suspended, and in that case, the country is ruled by the Privy Council, and the monarchy is head of the Privy Council. So there's a big reserve role for the monarchy in dealing with revolutionary uprisings. And in that respect, I'm with the Ekaterinburg Soviets. I hope it doesn't come to that, but if needs must. The other thing is, it'd be foolish to underestimate the way that they actually are. They're well trained. I have actually. I'll put my hand up. I have actually met one of the royals. I met the Princess Royal. I was boss of a small disability charity, and at an event, Princess Anne was representing her dad, and because it's to do with Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, and she moved from display to display, and she was able to speak quite knowledgeably about each one of those. So they're very well briefed. They're very, very well prepared. And I mean, the fact that she could move. I forget what the previous one was, but it was something totally unconnected to what we did. But she was able to talk quite knowledgeably about autism. And okay, the Duke of Edinburgh's bit about sort of do you still throw spears at each other and that sort of thing. I mean, I suspect he is untypical. I think that the other royals are very much better at pressing the flesh and ingratiating themselves. And it would be foolish to underestimate their appeal. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Anne McShane.
Hi, comrades. So what I wanted to raise was this whole question of vulnerability, because like Tina says that she thinks, the monarchy is vulnerable. Steve says that it's like end game. This is the last phase, which is the social monarchy, been the last phase of the British monarchy. But you see, like, vulnerable to what? Like, really, what is it that's causing them problems at the present time? And like, what is likely to happen in the absence of the working class taking action to overthrow the state? I mean, to me, they'll be rescued time and time again. And what surprised me watching it from Ireland, but obviously been able to tune in to the BBC, which I did immediately just to see what was being said, was the reverence with which Prince Philip was treated. Although, I mean, it's been known for years, like, and been, discussed on the BBC as well as The Guardian and other media sources, just what a bigot he was, a racist, a misogynist. And then, all of a sudden he's dead and he becomes somebody like he's been described as a feminist, a man who cared about the environment. I honestly thought when I first heard that they were talking about Prince Charles. I had no idea that this man had any interest in the environment. And really, I suppose, just to summarize, what struck me was just how committed the British establishment is to the monarchy and how it cannot be countenanced that there would be any other way that the British state would rule except through the monarchy. So I think that, like, when you say vulnerable, I think, well, I just can't see really how they're vulnerable in the absence of the working class taking some action. They maybe become more and more unpopular, but I just don't see the establishment doing anything except, moving to rescue them at every stage. I mean, like, obviously here in Ireland, we have a president who is elected, but then he's just simply a state figure, you know, he doesn't do anything, but everybody sees him going around shaking hands. He's kind of like an elected monarchy, really, you know, because he's not accountable at all. It's kind of the same as a figurehead. Now, I know there's lots of differences, but at the same time, his position is at the top of the constitution. So without him, you know, like to say, oh, we can get rid of the presidency. I just don't see it happening without the working class taking some action and becoming a real force. So, you know, really, I suppose that's my point, is that I can see, you know, you can look at them and they're, you know, like Prince Andrew, and you know what's happened with him and what a dolt Prince Charles is, and how, you know, the other two, Meghan and forgotten his name. Anyway, how badly treated they've been. How but sometimes it just feels like chattering classes, because they're really not vulnerable, are they? Who's going to get rid of them? I mean, they've had their times in the past where they've been extremely vulnerable with the abdication, you know, another, like, it seems to me that they've gone through a whole series of crises right from the beginning of their, you know, creation. But they've been able to survive it because of the fact that the working class hasn't become an opponent of the capitalist class and of the state. It hasn't presented a real alternative to it. Anyway, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Tony Greenstein.
Yeah, thank you. My apologies that I will have to leave after having made my contribution, simply because I've got another meeting to go to. I agree with Anne. I think Steve is wonderfully over-optimistic about the chances of being rid of the monarchy. Would that it were possible. I think that the monarchy is extremely valuable to the ruling class. It represents, in a sense, the organic unity that there is in the ruling class between the old feudal aristocracy and the industrialists and capitalists. And I don't think we're going to get rid of them very easily. And indeed, the existence of the monarchy and the perpetuation of the monarchy and the lack of any Republican sentiment which is organized at all within the Labour movement testifies, I think, to the political weakness of the working class. I mean, it is a comment on how, on their attachment to the crown and empire, and they are, if you like, also very much a legacy of British colonialism, the British Empire. I think for us, it's quite clear. I mean, there is an organization called Republican, isn't there, which is a bourgeois Republican movement. I think it's quite clear that the bourgeoisie will not get rid of the monarchy, even despite its many troubles. And the crisis over Princess Diana's death was indeed a very, very severe crisis. No one should be under any illusions. The popular sentiment against the Queen for not paying full tribute to Diana, who was probably the only human being that the monarchy's had in the last 200 years, in a sense. So it survived that. And today it has recuperated to at least a great extent. Certainly, I think there will be some form of political crisis when Elizabeth Windsor dies. And obviously we don't know when, but we can only hope for the best. And I think it's up to us really to raise the demand that she is the last monarch. And I think that will be raised by many other people. And the question is how we capitalize on it. But our attitude to the monarchy should be really the words of Percy Shelley, that the monarchy is a string that ties the robber's bundle, and that should be part of our propaganda, and it should be within the Labour movement as well. The question of monarchy has really not been raised by socialists, because we have seen it as an added extra, but not terribly important to the nature of our fight for socialism. Thank you. Anyway, I must disappear, but I'll see you hopefully tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I've got three more comrades who want to come in. Tina and Steve, do you want to reply to those? And I'm going to bring the next three in after them.
Okay, well, yes, sorry, I'm not muted, am I? Just checking I wasn't muted. I think the key thing to understand, and actually I think I've been slightly misrepresented. I was saying that although the objective conditions are ones of crisis, because it's a crisis within the state power. And it's not just about the royal family, although there are divisions within the royal family, okay, which I think is a reflection of the problems that the monarchy's actually got. It's really about the state power. The crown is the state power, and that state power is centered on Whitehall and Downing Street, whereas the Queen is centered on Buckingham. But now the two obviously are connected. It's not like we've got a crown power, but we don't need to have a monarchy. Obviously, the crown depends on the monarchy, just as the monarchy depends upon the crown. They're interdependent, but they're not the same thing. Now, I'm saying we've got a very deep crisis, a political crisis, because of the collapse of the post-war social contract, if you like. It's been so badly destroyed that we're now in a social crisis and in a political and constitutional crisis, and that's clear with the Scottish referendum, for example, and the Brexit thing. That's all part of our crisis. Okay. But I'm not saying that we're about to have a republic, not at all. In fact, I was saying the opposite. I was agreeing with Stephen Bush. There isn't any force in society. There is no class at the moment that appears to want to consciously want to have a democratic republic. That's the problem we've got. The Labour Party is not doing that. There isn't any other Republican party, in England especially. You could say it's different in Ireland, but in England, there is no actual Republican Party. And what that means for us is there is no class in society. I'm not talking about small little sects and, you know, people like ourselves or just fringe groups. I'm talking about masses. There is no mass movement, no political party that wants to get rid of the monarchy. Apparently 25% of people, it could be popular, by the way, 25% of the people claim to be some kind of Republican, but nobody's ever thought to mobilize that sentiment into a political force, and nobody seems to want to do it. So although I think objective conditions are that, as I said, the old is dying, but the new is not ready to be born. There is no force yet that can actually transform that, and certainly not the Labour Party. We just see how they've measured up in the course of this particular thing. But don't concentrate it all about getting rid of the Queen. That's merely a moment. Obviously, the Queen gives the power to the crown, as it were. But the point is that the crown is the thing that we have to deal with, and we have to make our democratic case against that. We're not a democracy in this country. We're a liberal state, and part of our liberal values are to tolerate all sorts of things, including the monarchy. You know, a lot of people love the Queen. Half of the population could manage to tolerate them, but we're getting a bit pissed off when there was too much radio and TV on. So our tolerance was tried by the fact that we had wall-to-wall coverage of the monarchy. So half the country was a bit pissed off, 100,000 people writing in. The other part were absolutely loving it all and wallowing it all. So, but I just think we have to think carefully about this distinction between, and maybe I'll come back on this, Kevin, because you raised it, and I'll stop now, let other people come in. But this distinction between the crown and, which is really the state power, and the monarch as such, and not just focus on the monarchy.
Okay, Tina?
Yeah, I think Anne kind of misunderstood what we were saying. I also don't think it's about to collapse or is particularly vulnerable. I think I said fragile, and I think the fact that it is fragile, you see in the fact that they put a lot of effort into keeping it alive, which, you know, if it was just accepted that it's a God-given thing, you know, you can't ever challenge things, then they wouldn't bother quite so much. A lot of effort is put into keeping the myths alive and keeping, you know, the illusion alive that this is a solid as a rock, you can never challenge it, etc. Diana was a huge moment, it can't be underestimated, abdication, etc. The situation we're in at the moment has potential, like all situations have potential to turn into something else quite quickly. There have, you know, some countries of the Commonwealth are discussing quite seriously about getting rid of the Queen as their head of state, especially because linked to all the racism claims. In Australia, I mean, there is quite a lot of pressure to get to make Australia into a proper republic. And you know, things can spiral quickly out of control quite quickly in politically fluid situations, the pandemic, etc., going on, etc. I'm not saying it's likely to happen, and you know, I also made the point that if she was gotten rid of, or the monarchy was gotten rid of as part of a sort of establishment move, or not from the working class pressure, but as a whatever, for whatever reasons, Prince Andrew, they found out he's been doing so and such with little girls and things like that, and the Queen knew, and Prince Charles. You can just about imagine how things can spiral out of control. But I totally agree with Anne as well. It's unlikely unless it's linked to actually a revolutionary situation, which is the same really with the capitalism. I believe capitalism is in decline, isn't it? Capitalism is so ready to be pushed out of the way and taken over and made into something human and democratic, and that actually produces. We're actually in a position where capitalism can produce for everybody. Nobody needs to fucking die of hunger, and yet people do. Nobody needs to live on the streets, and yet people do. The means of productions have been developed to a degree where, had we got the forces, we could take it over and really liberate humanity. It is ripe. The system is overly ripe to be taken over and done away with. What's missing is the subjective force of the working class making that last push. And that's what we're trying to say, isn't it? It's so important that we take this question seriously, how we're ruled. Because if we are about socialism, this is all about, ruling ourselves, remaking society from top to bottom, learning, the working class learning how to rule society. And yet, most of the left just says, oh, monarchy, House of Lords, that's boring. We need to, go and strike for higher wages. And that will sort of automatically, in the transitional program, make people more and more lefty, and they start questioning other things, etc. I don't think it works like that. And I think we have to have a goal where we're going to, and be quite clear what the goal is that we're pursuing. And it is the democratic transformation of society from bottom to top, and getting rid of things like the monarchy, taking it over for our purposes, and running it democratically. I was just going to say one thing, which is the social monarchy and things like that. When you have a child, you kind of see how ingrained it is on all levels of society. Just getting a child into scouts, she has to swear an oath. The football thing, it's just really everywhere. It's really effort to make it seep into everything. And in that aspect, I quite. The fact of Kate Middleton, you cannot underestimate. She's the new Diana, and more. She is perfect. She comes from a normal background. Her great granddad was a bricklayer and a miner. She's one of the people, working class, etc. Of course, she's also had a grandparent who was multi-millionaire. She was sent to public school. Met Prince William, blah, blah, blah. So she's not really of us, but she's things like that. She is going to become so important in making the monarchy look like it's of the people, for the people, to rule over the people. But look, it's one of us, who's there to rule over us. This is becoming very important, again, as a symbol, I think, of how fragile this system actually is, and how unnatural. There's nothing natural about being ruled like that. So yes, it makes it very important that we take these issues seriously, and not just leave it to the establishment to talk about and sort out.
Okay, thanks, Tina. 3 more comrades, Anthony Brain, and then Jerry Downing, and then Susan Richardson. So Anthony.
Yeah. Okay, I think we should not underestimate the capitalist crisis. Steve's right about the sectional dispute in the ruling class over how to rule over the Irish people, over Scotland. All the capitalist states are breaking up. In Germany, I was reading in a course, even under Kaiser, you had all the states determine their own autonomy. So all these, a lot of the states are artificial, like Belgium, Netherlands, are made of different nationalities, and forced unions, wars, revolutions, and counter-revolutions over many hundreds of years, and that's happening to the British states. But I agree more with Tina on the nature of the epoch of Lenin and Trotsky, war and revolution and counter-revolution. There's an unprecedented crisis. I mean, millions of working class people and millions of working and middle class people are really suffering now. What I thought was interesting on Twitter, a few weeks ago that people realize if you don't get rid of capitalism in the next year or two, there could be nuclear war. I mean, the tensions are building up. The Cold War's sharpening up now. For example, over Ukraine, because they put tens of billions trying to restore capitalism, and the putting of the Russia came in and reversed some of those inroads, and they're absolutely hysterical. The Chinese plan economy is going forward massively. It's undermining them in the third world. So there's tensions over Taiwan. They're only going to the summit now because the Stalinists and the imperialists have viewed together each other decade for decade since 1923. They know it's serious. They could go in. Now, if they go in, it could be a 1945 movement where it could lead to the left shift. In America, an explosive situation will know with the Black Lives Matter defunding the police. And in the American papers, they're talking about building, I wanted to lay the basis for Bernie Sanders to take off. Just one Boston paper reading 2 days ago. Today, I was reading in all the American papers praising Bernie Sanders up. I wonder if they're going to bring in Corbyn if he comes in. I don't agree with the Democratic Party. He shouldn't be in there. But if there's enough people there, will they laying the base for somebody like Corbyn to take over this unrest? There's going to be a real unrest in the next period because of the unprecedented crisis. And I thought when they're being morbid about the Duke of Edinburgh, it symbolised in the British capitalism there. They're fine on their feet more than was Trust said in 1939, and they're really morbid because they're really they're trying to mass up people, left shifts. They're totally unstable, and with their instability and their fears of the masses going left, they were out of touch even with the mass feeling. And they overdid it, and they've had to pull back. So it's all these. I think all these processes are at. Well, I think there's a big chance of it. We should not underestimate the possibility of change. But how the institutions are ruled, as Tina said, the working class full society is key. Because in this period, if the ruling class disputes build up, the monarchy will be used against different wings and moved against the working class. Or they have to, in a revolution, they might get sacrificed and establish the capitalist system like they did in Germany. I think there's big opportunities for the left to go forward in the next period. But the middle class realize if you don't give it to capitalism, there'll be no future for it. I think there were more fundamental change than even during the Russian Revolution. There's other dangers of fascism with the Le Pen will be in power in a year, but the Muslims are the biggest Muslim population are linking up with the middle class theatre revolt, and they're not getting their own way. And of course, if they're getting near power, they'll be able to smash unions and try and crucify that. There could be a revolution against them. But a lot of the middle class are going to the left. But we don't know what's going to happen in the Labour Party. Either the left gets the party about, there could be a major split. And then if the left at the party, there's another left party set out this split, you get a mass base overnight because people want to end of these wars and all the poverty. It's getting a mass support. I'll end it there.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Jerry Downey.
All right, okay, I'm unmuted. I just don't know what Republican democracy is and how it's better than constitutional monarchy democracy. I think that actually Britain is sort of got as much Republican democracy as any of the other so-called Republican democracy states in the continents. There's France and Germany and Italy, for instance, and then there's the United States, a great republic, of course. I read a column by one Malcolm Rogers in the Irish Post last week, and he was making these comparisons, and he said that well actually these constitutional monarchies compare quite favorably with the Republican monarchies, because if we look at the United States, just look what came bursting out of the hedge 4 years ago. Well, obviously what came bursting out of the hedge was a wild boar, which was far worse than anything you would see in any of the constitutional monarchies. So I think that this argument that what we want to do is achieve for ourselves a Republican democracy is a bogus argument, and it's a diversion away from what is the essential task. The essential task, as the last contribution made clear, and as Anne has made clear, and as Tina made clear, is actually the capitalist system itself. And we don't really want to be diverted from that. Industrial action is now beginning to develop on the buses and British Gas and on everywhere else. It's meeting huge problems from the trade union bureaucracy. That is the big problem that's now facing ourselves. If we think we can get around that by simply getting rid of this monarchy, then that will not do us at all. The relationship between that, the working class are not kept oppressed by the monarchy, they're kept oppressed by capitalism. And they're kept oppressed by capitalism because workers must enter into that relationship in order to make their living. The relationship of the means of production, they must sell their labor power and to the capitalists. And because they must sell their labor power to the capitalists, they're dependent on the capitalists, and they see capitalism rising above themselves as an unsupport, a power that is all powerful and they cannot overthrow until their anger gets out of control and they begin serious industrial struggle. We have now got the least industrial struggle than we have since way back when the records began in something like 1896. So that's the real problem. Getting rid of the monarchy, I agree that getting rid of the monarchy would be a great progressive step forward. It would begin to unleash the whole British Constitution thing. When I did my Open University degree, I was bold enough to say that there isn't a British Constitution. And they said, oh, no, you're wrong. There is a British Constitution. It's just that it's not written down. It's not there, in fact, but it's there. It's there in all these other bills of rights and everything. There isn't a British Constitution. If you wanted to make a British Constitution, if you wanted to get rid of the monarchy, if you wanted to do all that, you would unravel all that whole thing that holds the class system together. So I agree, but I agree with Steve on that level, that if the monarchy was to go, then the whole of the British Constitution would begin to go, and the whole of the class relationship would begin to go. But as for Republican democracy, I really don't know what that is, and it's not a thing. I'm for Soviet democracy from the bottom up, for workers' councils, and not for bourgeois parliaments. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Susan Richardson, we haven't got any other comrades indicating that they want to come in after Susan. So if you could put your hands up, that would be very helpful. Okay, Susan.
Okay, I'm going to upset people now. I think I would stand up for the monarchy in present circumstances, partly because the Queen, poor woman, has had to live her entire life in the public eye. And she's done it with, I think, considerable dignity. And even Charlie, at least, is doing things like fight for climate change and that sort of, fighting against climate change and that sort of thing. I think if we're going to get rid of the monarchy, we need to do it when there is a decent socialist party powerful in Parliament. And at the moment, there isn't, is there? You know, if I've got to choose between the Queen and Boris, I would choose the Queen, I'm afraid. You know, and I think if you really want to get rid of the monarchy, you've got to make sure that there is a democratic, proper, well, Republican Party, if you like, or whatever you want to call it. But you want to make sure that there is a sort of reasonable socialist view in Parliament. And at the moment, there really isn't, is there? So that's it, really. And at least the Queen's, you know, doing her best, poor woman. Okay. Okay,
thanks, Susan. Some interesting comments there. I don't know if any other comrades want to come in from the floor at all. I've had quite a few sort of comments so far. I've got maybe two things I'd like to add. Partly, I think it was Zbigniew, although Zbigniew put it in the chat column, and I'm not entirely sure if I've got the question right. But he's asking both Tina and Steve, I think, to talk about the forces that we would need to replace the monarchy. At least that's the sense. And it's probably linking into this, this discussion about the sort of popular mood, but above all, how we campaign and how we organize against the monarchy and why it's important. And in particular, the sort of forces that could maybe be ranged against us. One other comment I would make, and it's on this sort of relic idea, and it's also something that a number of comrades have alluded to. I think Jerry and Anne, but I think Steve and Tina have in their various ways. And this is the power of the monarchy. Not only its social power, it's not only in the coronation mug, it's not only in the oath of allegiance in the Scouts. Other youth organizations are available, Tina, by the way. It isn't only in the way that the monarchy is presented as unifying the nation. It's also its political power. And there's one very clear example of that in my lifetime, which was the situation in Australia in 1975 with Gough Whitlam, who was a Labour Prime Minister, who was turfed out. And this was done through using the prerogative powers of the monarch as the head of the state in Australia. And I would suggest, although it was very unlikely that Corbyn would ever have got near to Downing Street, and that would have been the Labour Party would have stopped him doing that. The Parliamentary Labour Party, they wouldn't need to do anything like that. But you may recall in the run-up to the election that there were several figures, particularly in the armed forces and elsewhere, who suggested that the monarchy, that Corbyn would be disloyal, the army's oath of allegiance to the monarch, not to the state, and above all, not to that fictional constitution that Jerry refers to, could all have been used even in the mildest form of political crisis. So I think we do need to be aware that there are very real examples. I would also add a small one, which again some of the older comrades here will remember. In the early 70s, when many sections of the ruling class wondered whether Britain was becoming ungovernable, there were various rumours involving Louis Mountbatten, who was the uncle of the Duke of Edinburgh, that he was involved in coup attempts against the Labour government. So these people have not only social power, social status, but they could also be a reserve weapon, a constitutional reserve weapon in any period of crisis. I could go on with the role of the King in 1931 in the formation of the Labour government. I could, talk about those issues, but I think we need to really see the monarchy as a power, as a social power, and as a political power, which reveals the undemocratic nature of capitalism, but also something that our movement should fight against, not just regarded as a sideshow, or even, I would say, just as a sort of a picturesque novelty that brings in foreign tourists and is, a nice sort of irrelevance. It has real potential power. And I think if we're moving in to periods of political instability of the sort that comrades have described, then I think it's one of those factors we really do have to take into account. The monarchy mystifies the state, and the state is about power. And when it's dressed up in an elderly woman and a rather dysfunctional family, that hides that power. That's the function of mystifications. And our job as socialists is to cut through that and to expose power but also to expose our potential as a working class movement as well. Anyway, comrades, I'll bring in Steve first of all, and then Tina to do the final summing up.
Unmute myself.
Yeah.
Well, now I'm muted. Unmute myself. I already have, I think, but anyway, there we go. So, thanks, Kevin. Just on that last point, I think it's very important. It's about the crown and the monarchy, and this we need to get this real distinction between them. It's so very important because it's there that the mystification and, if you like, the false consciousness that is the source of the power of the crown. It's our misunderstanding. So the Queen appears to be powerless, having no power whatsoever. She merely, we'll hear it said, she doesn't do anything political. Now, I don't believe this, by the way, because she's a very political person, but even if we took it at face value, the whole essence of the argument about the monarchy is that the Queen is powerless. And if she's powerless, what's the point in getting rid of her? It's just a waste of space, waste of time. But therefore, she's the mystification of the fact that the power of the crown is very, very powerful institution. I mentioned Her Majesty's Treasury, the magic money tree, where all the money is, and that's what should be investigated. And that power is wielded by Boris Johnson and the Chancellor, etc., and Cabinet Secretary and various other people that aren't elected, by the way. If we started to look into who the key players were, who was really wielding the power in this country, most of them aren't elected, by the way, and most of them aren't even elected politicians. So we'd have to look into, we'd have to investigate that. But when we look at that, what we find is the crown is very powerful because the crown is the state power. It is the kingly power, if you like. The kingly power not wielded by the Queen, but wielded by Boris Johnson. Now, what are the checks and balances against Boris Johnson? Is the Queen going to turn around and say, Boris, you can't prorogue Parliament? Well, that never happened. So she may be formally the powerful person in that, but how is she using that power? Not really at all. It's being deployed by somebody else. And we're mystified by that because we can't see where the problem is. The problem is the power of the crown, which is a very powerful institution. That's what we've got to look out for. Now, Jerry had a point. Now, Jerry had there were two Jerrys, okay? Jerry number one and Jerry number two. So Jerry number two sort of agreed with me because he thought, actually, after it's all gone, it would unleash a whole revolution. And it would be radical and it would be fantastic. And he said he agreed with me. And then Jerry number one didn't agree with me at all. He was totally opposed to it because Jerry number one was mixing up economic and political power. That was the source of his mistake. But you think, well, economic power is capitalism. We need to get control of that. But the fact is, it's political power that you have to get. First, the working class must have the political power, must win political power in order to act on the economic power. If it wasn't that the case, then syndicalism would be the correct strategy. Because we didn't need to worry about political power or winning state power or any of those other things. You would just sort of organize in the factories, full stop. But Marx was absolutely clear. The first task of the working class is to win political power. And if you look in State and Revolution, Lenin is very clear about that. A republic is the form that the working class will come to power. So he brings republicanism in. So really, Jerry number two was correct. And unfortunately, Jerry number one is being quite economistic and not understanding that. And he's making this mistake of saying we're really a crowned republic, because the Queen has no power. We're really a republic with a crown. And then he says America's a republic. Well, formally, but you could argue, and I have argued before, that America is an elected monarchy. What the Americans did when they got rid of the British, they didn't create a proper republic. What they did was they decided they'd have a king. They give the kingly power to somebody, and then they'd limit that power by Congress. They'd limit that power because they were frightened of the kingly power. They give it to a president, but he only stands twice. So in a way, the concentration of crown power, if you like, is in the hands of the American president. And very, very powerful that is today, 200 years ago. So in a way, America is formally a republic, but it's not really a democratic republic, which is a question that Jerry asked me. So let's come back to what is Republican democracy. Well, I'll give you 2 points that I think are important. Point number one, it is the idea that sovereignty rests with the people. And then it's the second idea that if sovereignty rests with the people must have the power to be able to exercise that power. They must be able to elect people, make them accountable, bring them subject to recall, make sure they're only paid the average wage, make them fully accountable. And if we want a little example of those principles in practice, you wouldn't do far from looking at the Paris Commune, for example, where Marx explains why those principles were in practice there. And if you were to apply those principles in the Labour Party, it would mean that the members of the Labour Party were the sovereign members of the Labour Party, and that they must have the democratic power to bring everybody to account, including their MPs, and get rid of them and call them to account and not have them on fat salaries and all those other things. Accountability, democracy, subject to recall. Then you'd have a very different kind of Labour Party if you applied Republican democratic principles to it. And those principles don't just have to stick with the Labour Party. You can have them in the trade union movement, and you could have them for the whole of society. So that's what I mean by Republican democracy coming from below, power coming from below. Now, you know, to get that is a big task. But I mean, that's where you have to go with it, I would say. And I'm going to say one other thing, if I could, which was I'm pleased that Susan spoke up, because although she said something I didn't really expect to hear somebody making that point on here, I think it's really good that we did have somebody saying that, because that's the kind of arguments that are broader in the movement that we have to deal with. We have to answer what Susan said. She kind of said, I think, she would be in favour of it. She sort of said, well, I may have misunderstood this. I think she said she preferred the Queen to Boris Johnson because at least the Queen isn't really doing anything particularly bad. Boris Johnson's a bit of a dangerous character. But, you know, I would say these two things are connected together. Boris Johnson's got the power he's got because the Queen exists. And if you're worried about Boris Johnson, then the fact that he's got that kingly power and can use that kingly power and has used it quite ruthlessly and quite corruptly, and we can't seem to do anything about it, that's the thing we have to worry about. The Queen is not a check and balance against the kingly power of King Boris Johnson. And that's what we have to think about. Our constitution doesn't help us. Our constitution doesn't protect us. We don't even know what our constitution is. There's some laws that we don't necessarily understand, but hey, it's a hell of a mess. And it has to be sorted out. Finish there.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Tina.
Yeah, good summing up from both Steve and Kevin. It doesn't leave much for me to talk about, but I thought it was both were really good. Yeah, Jerry, yeah, I noted him down as well. Obviously, I was arguing against him in my introduction without him having spoken yet. So yeah, he is, you know, calling it a diversion to fight against the monarchy. You know, and I'm fighting against, you know, we're oppressed by capitalism, not the monarchy. But exactly, I mean, this is the point of this whole meeting, is trying to point out they are very integral, you know, to each other. They're very much keeping each other you know, alive and in ruling over us together. On the role of the political monarchy, I mean, while it's true that the Queen itself, you know, herself doesn't really get involved, etc., and she's independent and didn't even want to say about Brexit, etc., it is also becoming clear that, you know, behind the scenes there is stuff going on, as you'd expect. There's the spider letters by Prince Charles, who's doing some hardcore lobbying of politicians. But it's also emerged a few months ago, I think it was, that there's been over 1,000 laws where actually the Buckingham Palace got involved. You know, they get sent all the laws before publication, etc. They got involved. They sometimes change things, or propose to change various things. You know, 1,000 laws is not nothing, isn't it? It's you don't get to see the details, but they have been involved in these things. But that's not the real question. The real question is, you know, the method. I think we have to think about why we're saying we need to get rid of the monarchy, and it's not because the US is more, you know, democratic or not. I think it's perversion to call a system like the US a democracy, like the same word perversion to call Britain a democracy. You can go to, you know, vote every 4 years. That's not a democracy. That is a elected, you know, dictatorship, if you will, over us. We have very little, the working class, the people have very, very little influence on ruling society, actually, which is why we say, socialists should take the question of the monarchy very seriously and how we're ruled. It goes to the heart of what socialism is. It goes to the heart of liberating ourselves, ruling ourselves. We are becoming the rulers. And I think Diana earlier said in the chat, I don't want to be ruled by anybody. No, neither do I. We are all becoming the rulers. The working class is taking over. The 99%. We should be deciding how we run, not the 1% who is, the elected, so-called elected dictatorship over us. It's a perversion to call this a democracy. So I think it's very much a question of training ourselves as well. This is why we're taking these questions of democracy seriously. It's a training ourselves to become the ruling force in society, i.e. the vast majority should be the ones who decide what we're doing and how we're doing it, and not the 1% at the top. So this is very much about a way to actually get to socialism. It's a way to make ourselves into the rulers, the people who can take over and do a much better job on behalf of the people, for the people, because we're them. We're not we are liberating ourselves and all of humanity.
Okay, thanks Tina, thanks Steve for that, and I'd like to thank all the comrades who came in and made contributions. I think good discussion, some good points made. And I think the point about the future is also well made, that when Elizabeth Windsor dies, then I think there will be further questions, and it will be important for socialists to intervene in that and to campaign, not in terms of the personality, not in terms that Charles is in some way morally unfitted to be a king. Nobody's morally fitted to be a king. It's an immoral position. In fact, it's a case that it's wrong to have a monarchy, wrong not only in principle terms, but also in terms of the political and social powers the comrades have said. So I think the death of the Duke of Edinburgh raises these questions, but in the natural way of things, I think within the next few years, they're likely to be raised again. And again, we have to raise the political alternative, not just simply to talk about the personalities concerned. Before we wrap up this evening, a couple of reminders. Tomorrow evening, Tony continues his series of sessions on the nature of Zionism. And he's looking at one of the most important areas, the relationship between Zionism and the Nazis, the complexities and the debate about that in the Nazi period, a controversial area which is where socialists have come in for attack for revealing the nature of Zionism's cooperation with the Nazis, and indeed what that points to towards the nature of Zionism as a political movement and indeed as a state form. So that's tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. And then next Thursday, we're having another one of our sort of smaller sessions before we begin the long education program again. And that will be Bob Allen, who's going to talk about the London recruits. And these were the socialists and the communists in London who were recruited to join the ANC's campaign against apartheid. And they went to South Africa to take part in the armed struggle there against apartheid. So that will be next week at 6 o'clock in the Thursday slot, and Tony's sessions on Zionism will continue in the Friday slot. So I'd like to thank everybody for taking part, and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow and next week. So good evening, comrades, and enjoy what's left of the light evenings. Right.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye-bye.
Bye.